Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Rock Daydream Nation, and we have got the return of the Aussie Wrecking Crew talking about Australian music that other channels don't talk about. Today, we are going to do a show on Aussie Dark Horse albums. Now, a Dark Horse album is an album that didn't sell very well, or it was critically maligned, or perhaps it's just kind of forgotten in that particular artist's discography. So we'll go through the crew. We've got Liam here from 94.6 FM. How are you, mate?
Good. Absolutely
Fantastic.
fantastic.
Good stuff. Bicycle Legs, always good to see you.
Always a pleasure, Peter.
Harrison from Grab a Stack of Rock. Good to see you, Harrison.
Good to be
And,
back.
and Peter Wicks from Wixie Leagues. Good to have you on board. All right. So why don't we start proceedings and I'll go to each. We'll do one each, two picks, and then we'll do some honorable mentions at the end. I'll start off with you, Liam. What's
Okay.
your first pick as a Dark Horse Aussie album?
All right, we're going into the late 80s with this one. We're going 1988, 1989. Not too particularly sure when this one was released. Race from Pseudo Echo. Now, the band itself, they took a while to actually come around to returning to this material again, so it only was until their very recent sets where we started seeing material from the Race album come back for live playing. But the album itself was kind of going towards a more mainstream rock sound in the line of Sammy Hagar Van Halen. So tracks like Forward Again, Over Tomorrow, they were really cool standout hits, but the album itself absolutely just was panned by the critics. Band Brian Cam did not like it for the longest time. And I've always enjoyed it. A lot of really great moments on there. The instrumental Metropolis and, of course, Eye of the Storm, some other favorites. So that's my first pick.
So with Race, you could say that's the Pseudo Echo hair metal album, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So probably a bridge too far for the core audience where they were kind of synth pop superstars on Countdown, and then a couple of years later, bit Bon Jovi-esque, eh?
Yeah. Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you know what? You could kind of tell that they were going in that direction with their cover of Funky Town, because Funky Town still has the synths and stuff on it, but it's got a lot of guitar on it as well.
Yeah,
So,
and Cannon's, getting out the guitar, doing a little bit of a solo, and yeah, a little bit more flash. So yeah, I saw Pseudo Echo last year, and they are killer live, and they are now starting to bring out a lot of their race material. All right, that's a cracker of an opening. Dark Horse, Bicycle Legs. What's your first pick? Dark Horse
all
album.
right. Well, my first pick is going to be from 1982. It's going to be the last album this band did for a very, very long time. They changed their name ever so slightly before this album came out. Before this album, they were JoJo Zepp and the Falcons. Now they were just JoJo Zepp, and the album is Char. Now, there were a couple of singles on this album that did quite well at the time. There was Taxi Mary, and there was their cover of the Burt Bacharach song Walk On By. But the album itself kind of didn't do very much at all. And I was looking today, actually, this album isn't even on streaming services. Like their other JoJo Zepp and the Falcon albums, Screaming Targets and Hats Off, Step Lightly, things like that. They're all on your Spotify's and your Amazon Primes and your whatever. But this album isn't. So, in that respect, it's kind of forgotten as well because you can't even find it on streaming services. But I really, really love this album. It's like part synth pop, it's part salsa music. There's lots of horns on this album. You get the wonderful Jane Clifton does vocals on a couple of the songs. She does a duet with Joe Camilleri on Taxi Mary, and she does the solo lead vocal in a song called You're Gonna Get It Boy. Also, a number of the songs on here are co-written with Paul Kelly, believe it or not. They don't sound anything like Paul Kelly songs because I'm pretty sure Paul Kelly's contribution to these songs was lyrics rather than music. But yeah, there's like about four songs co-written with Paul Kelly on this album. So that's rather interesting, I think. But I really love this album. You know, some of it's soul says it reminds me a little bit of an album that came out a few months earlier than this, which was Joe Jackson's Night and Day album. So it's got a lot of that kind of flavor to it. But you've also got like some of the older, more sort of new wavy sound that Joe Josette and the Falcons had. And you've also got like one of my favorite songs on this album is a song called Man Is Just a Boy, which almost has a bit of an Oingo Boingo feel to it. It's just wonderful. So yeah, forgotten album in the sort of Joe Camilleri, Joe Josette oeuvre, but really, really good album, well worth checking out. Char.
I love Joe Camilleri, especially JoJo Zepp and the Falcons, and I think Screaming Targets is just such an awesome album. And I picked up an American copy from Red Eye Records, and it was a completely different sort of cover, and it was on the Columbia label. So it was just interesting to see a Mushroom record on a major label, but needless to say, I don't think it sold very well. All right, Harrison, what's your pick for the Dark Horse?
All right. Well, despite the fact that I suggested this topic, I actually had a lot of trouble finding albums. So, this first album is actually one that sold quite well, but it's sort of been forgotten since then, and that's from 1984, Cold Chisel's 20th Century.
That qualifies.
This was an album that it was plagued with sort of production troubles behind the scenes, which sort of led to the band split a bit later down the line. This was the last album they made of their initial stint, to the point that there's actually two drummers on this album. Some are played by Ray Arnott, and the others are played by Steve Prestwich. So, I'm not here to tell you that these albums are, masterpieces that have been forgotten. They shouldn't be just, overlooked, forgotten. There's some good stuff on here. So, obviously the singles, Flame Trees was the biggest hit. Saturday Night was a hit as well. I'm not all that fond of that one. But in terms of deep cuts, 20th Century is great. I like No Sense. The Game is great as well. Fans of Barnes' earlier type of singing, where he wasn't as shouty, will like The Game and will like No Sense. My favorite song on the album is the very last one, Temptation, which just has a riff that drives like a freight train. It's a real shame that it really got forgotten after this. It was in Barnes's sets in the early days of his solo career, but after that it's been forgotten, to the point that when I saw it on that album, I was actually struggled to find what album it originally came from. It was only when I bought this that I looked and I'm like, oh, so that's where it's from. But I like this album, even if it's not the best album they've ever put out.
No, all good. And I was actually considering putting this up because that is a prime example of a Dark Horse album. And I'm a little bit contrarian. It might be one of my favorite Cold Chisel albums. Just a quick plug, Liam Hare and myself did a show on Cold Chisels, had a lot of views. If you haven't seen it, check it out. And we're talking about why Cold Chisel weren't bigger internationally, which is a bit of a head scratch. I saw Cold Chisel recently, a couple of weeks ago. They were sensational. They played a hell of a lot of tracks off this album. And actually Saturday Night, Harrison's one of my favorites. Is there any reason you don't like it, or is it a little bit too outside the wheelhouse? I think that's one of their greatest songs.
It just bores me a little. It takes too long to get going, sort of thing. And when it does get going, it's not that great, in my opinion. It's like you wait all this time and it's just, I call it the jugulator effect after Judas Priest's Jugulator. You have to listen to like 30 seconds of industrial clanking, then a slow intro, and then by the time you get to the chorus, it's like, I waited all this time for this.
Anyway, no, I think it's a mood piece. I love it. But look, Flame Trees, I think a lot of folk agree, is probably one of the greatest Australian songs of all time. And I even like Build This Love, the first song, which has got a little bit of soul. I think Renee Gay...
this album's got a bit funkier.
A bit soul. Yeah. Renee Gay is one of the backup singers. And No Sense is a killer. And Hold Me Tight, just one of their kind of balls out 50 Jerry Lee Lewis sort of patashes. So
yeah, there's a couple of songs on the album that are like only like a minute 40, like Ghost Town and I forgot the other one, probably Hold Me Tight. There's it's just this short in and out sort of thing, in the vein of like the Box Tops, The Letter.
Yeah, no, great pick. spot on. All right, Peter Wicks, what's your dark horse?
Okay. Mine's a bit more modern than those. So I'm going in 2017, fourth album called Killer by Dan Sultan. I think Dan Sultan has been, I know he's got a couple of ARIA awards, but I think he's been pretty heavily overlooked by mainstream. And Killer's the album that got it in for me. The guy's just, it's got a very bluesy sound, almost American gospel sound to some of the tracks, particularly songs like Kingdom. My favourite track is the opening track, which is Drover, which is basically about the Indigenous slavery Aboriginal slavery we had, which no one really likes to talk about. We had our own slave trade over here that doesn't get much of a mention. Blackbirding, you may well have heard of it. Look it up if you haven't. But this song goes into that. And anyway, it's just a fantastic album. It's just, the guy's just got a phenomenal voice.
Yeah, it's a name that I'm sort of hear a lot about, but I haven't really sort of investigated any of his work. So I'll definitely check that out.
It's a good place to start.
Absolutely. Appreciate that. All right. Well, my next pick, remember at the early part of this century, there was a revival called garage rock. And you had bands like The Hives, White Stripes, The Strokes. It was a real revival type of movement. One of them was an Australian band fronted by a guy called Craig Nichols. And his album was voted like the album of the year. And the band was called The Vines, and that was highly evolved. They were like on the front of a meteor. A year or two later, they put out an album called Winning Days. And this is where it started to crash. NME said they were the biggest thing since sliced bread. And in 2004, they retracted that and said, what were we thinking? This album's a disaster. It is far from a disaster. I think Winning Days is a perfect melding of Nirvana, because you've got that Nirvana crunchy rock and roll, and also Beatles. And they're the two artists that you can obviously see in this album that Craig Nichols really admires. The big single was Ride, which is just garage rock bliss. I think it was part of an Apple commercial. And then there's a lot of different songs like The Winning Days, Amnesia, where it's beautiful languid ballads, emotional sweet music, kind of sunny pop, Beatlesque, and then there's a little bit of shoegaze. But there's a lot of rock crunch. Nirvana, it's noisy, it's angry, it's belligerent. And there's even a little bit of power pop, like a song called She's Got Something to Say to Me, which sounds like a Lost Smithereens track. So, look, highly evolved. That sold a ton in America. I think it reached number 11, and they were nudging platinum. This album only reached number 23, didn't attain gold status. So it's sort of like they had that one shot at stardom. I think it's always been on public record that Craig Nichols had issues with dealing with fame, and there were quite a few meltdowns. Look at the David Letterman show where he trashed the drum kit. I don't think he was ever allowed to go back to the NBC studios after that. He's an interesting character. I've seen them live a few times, and I think that they're the real deal. And there is some genius in their work. But for me, it's not the first album. It's this album. And this is a definite dark horse album, Winning Days, which is sort of a melding between Beatles pop and Nirvana. Any of you folks like The Vines or got this album?
I haven't got that album, but I've certainly got Highly Evolved, and yeah, you can hear the Nirvana and Beatles on that even. But it got awfully hard to follow up an album like Highly Evolved. It was massive. And it's such a good album too.
Huge. And every album since, it was sort of like they were repeating the same sort of sound, and it was sort of diminishing returns. And I don't even know if I think they're kind of defunct. They might have done a reunion a couple of years ago, but it's sort of, I don't know. It's kind of a case of whatever happened to Craig Nichols.
Yeah.
All right, Liam, what's your number 2 pick?
All right, my number two pick, and it was one that I was looking forward to speaking on because I absolutely just love this album, despite what some of my friends say about this one. 1984's Southern Stars from Rose Tattoo. So, an album that had some songs about the history of Eureka Stockade in Freedom's Flame, which is a personal favorite one of mine. And I think it took them a long time to come around to this album, sort of the same way the Race album was for Pseudo Echo to actually play more of the material live. So that recent tour that they did, the Southern Stars 2024 tour, it was a really great celebration of that album and one certainly not to be forgotten. There you go, Rose Tattoo with Southern Stars for my number two pick.
I love that song, I Wish. And when I interviewed Angry Anderson, that was one of the songs I sort of cherry picked. It's one of his favourites too. I think that was probably my entry point to Rose Tattoo and actually seeing them live in the day, that whole album. And it should have been a lot bigger. But I won't say a bad thing about Rose Tattoo.
I'll just say one thing. I quite like that album, but the cover's a bit naff.
Angry Conquering the World.
Yeah, it's that
With the
sort of,
meteorite?
it's just it's a bit silly, isn't it?
I'll pass that on directly.
Oh, you're in for it now. Uh,
Yeah. All right, over to you, Bicycle Legs.
All
First
right.
Farnsey, now Angry.
Now, my number two Dark Horse album is first solo album by this guy. It's a band I've talked about before on this show, which is Goanna. I love Goanna. They did two albums and then broke up because the second album, I could have picked the second album as a Dark Horse album, Oceania, but I have talked about it on this channel before, so I didn't want to go back to that well. But they broke up after that album, and Shane Howard, the lead singer, main songwriter, put out an album called Back to the Track. And this is quite different from Goanna in as much as, both of those Goanna albums are really well produced. They're quite slick, great songwriting and great singing and great playing, but they're very, very well produced albums. This is really lo-fi. It's recorded in some tiny little studio in Melbourne. It's self-produced. It's pretty much, but it makes it a really great showcase for Shane Howard's songwriting and his singing. I think he's an underrated singer. I love the fact that he's one of the few Australian singers who isn't embarrassed to sing in a fairly broad Australian accent. There's nothing Americanized about him. And the songwriting on here is wonderful. He's getting into more of the big hit for Goanna was Solid Rock, which was talking about Indigenous issues and that sort of thing. He gets into that a lot more on this album. But it's just a really great, if you're into sort of singer-songwriter, acoustic music, this is an album for you. And if you're into great songwriting, songs like Just a Feeling, Mother Earth is really, really beautiful and haunting. One-Eyed Johnny is a great sort of rocker. It's really up-tempo and great. The title track, Back to the Track, is really good. Brothers and Sisters, he's starting to explore his sort of Celtic influences that would come across a lot more on some of his later work. And it ends with Come On Make Me, which I think is just a really, really great album closer. The next album he would do would be an album called River. It would be back to being a much more polished production. It was produced by Mark Moffat. And he had kind of a hit on that album with a song called Walk on Fire. I remember the clip being played for that a lot and that sort of thing. But this album flew completely under the radar. I probably only knew about this because I was such a big Goanna fan. Well worth checking out if you've never heard this album.
Great pick. And I have to agree with you. The lead singer of Goanna is distinctly Australian. He'd be up there with John Williamson, wouldn't he? Just that Aussie twang, and probably the lead singer Red Gum Schumann. Is
John Schumann, yeah.
John Schumann, yeah, right up there. Distinctly Australian. Absolutely. Yeah. Good pick. Harrison, what's your number 2?
All right, from 1993, another album that was the last one they did of their original stint, Baby Animals, Shaved and Dangerous. So to set the scene, Baby Animals' debut album, ridiculously good, sold like bananas, was the greatest selling Australian debut album of all time until Jet came along. I think the Baby Animals is the better album of the two, but you know. Shaved and Dangerous, however, it's a step up in terms of songwriting. It feels like a band that's evolved and matured. Not to say that the original Baby Animals was immature or thing, but it was a bit more, straight out and out rock and roll with a few softer songs on it. This one, it feels like a step up. So you got the bluesy ballad, Lights Out at 11 with a spellbinding solo. At the end of the day, the verses are sung in French. And in general, even though it's a lot more uneven affair, because there are lower lows than the first album, there are some highs that are probably higher. I love Backbone, I love Stupid, I love Because I Can. Even some of the more middle of the road songs like Love and Lies, Bupata, Nervous at Night, they're still good. I love Life from a Distance. And then you've got this version that I have here, which you might have noticed does have different cover art. This is the 1994 tour edition from their God Shave the Queen tour. And this has 3 bonus tracks, just new studio tracks, original material. They're pretty much in the same vein as the rest of the album. A couple of them are great. I like the first 2, She Does Whatever and Harmony Children in particular. So they sort of act as an extension to the album. So it brings it up to 14 songs, but I think it ends it on a higher note. So I think it's a better listening experience, even if it's a longer listening experience. But the band would go on to break up after the release of the album. Critical reception wasn't as great as the first album, but I think there's a lot of really good stuff on here to love.
Yeah. Why do you think they never broke it big in America? Because it sounds like that first album was absolutely killer, and they've got the sound that you think would have broken. Yeah,
it's odd because they toured with Van Halen for their first album, so they got exposure in that. I know Susie DeMarchi's voice was a bit ragged on that tour towards the end of it. The live album on the 25th edition, you can sort of hear the tour took it out of it, but she still sounds great, and the rest of the band are on fire.
Yeah,
I honestly don't know. I mean, there's no accounting for taste.
Yeah, when she was married to Nuno,
that too. He has a writing credit on one of the songs.
Yeah. What's the guitar work? Dave Leslie's still in the. He's on that album, is he?
I think so.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, it's all the original. Not original, but all the people from the first lineup.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. Good pick. Peter Weeks, what's your number 2 pick?
All right. My number 2 pick is from 2014. It's another Indigenous artist, a guy by the name of Briggs. I've mentioned him in the past in other shows, but he's well known as a rapper. He's an actor. He's a comedian. He's even written a children's book. There's not much that this guy can't do. So in 2014, he brought out an album called Shep Life, which is basically about growing up in Shepparton. And as someone who does a fair bit of work in Shepparton currently, I can appreciate a lot of where he's coming from. It's if you're into rap, it's along the lines of if you can to compare it to anyone, I'd say it'd be Ice Cube or NWA. I know he's got another album coming out soon, which is going to be more like a Rage Against the Machine, full on guitar and heavy. He's been hanging out with Mike Patton while Mr. Bungle were touring, and he's done some. He got up and did vocals at a NoFX concert. So, but anyway, this Shep Life is an awesome album, and best tracks. Let It Be Known, the opening track, is just an absolute stomper. Rather Be Dead and Purgatory, and yeah, it's just a fantastic album. Check it out if you're looking for something different. it actually ties in also with Dan Sultan. One of Breeze's other bands is AB Original, and best known for their song January 26, about changing the date for Australia Day, and Dan Sultan did the backup vocals. So there you go. They're actually tied together.
Yeah, a bit of synergy. All right. Thank you. You've mentioned this artist before. I will definitely have to check him out. Absolutely. All right. I'm going to talk about In Excess. So this album I've always championed, but it's one of the later albums. And this came out in 1993, and it's Full Moon, Dirty Hearts. Now, I don't think this album gets enough of a rap or accolades, because this is the period where In Excess, their commercial fortunes were starting to dive. I think this is a much more direct, stripped back album. It's the songwriting is a notch above, say, X, for example, or Welcome to Wherever You Are. It's got some great songs. The Gift, for example, is just, you listen to that and it's like techno industrial. It's like a Nine Inch Nails song, killer song, and it's probably one of my favorite In Excess songs. Days of Rust, Time, which is an anthemic rocker. I even like The Police, You Got That, which is the duet that Michael did with Ray Charles. At the time, I thought it was a bit contrived and a little bit of a stunt casting to have a duet, but I was listening to this a couple of times, and I thought it's kind of neat. Got that R&B and soul voice. Full Moon, Dirty Heart brings in Chrissy Hines. It's a wonderful ballad, emotional sweep. And when you listen to this song, you go, wow, Hutchins had a fantastic voice. I mean, everyone talks about the rock god and, he had the presence and the charisma. But gee whiz, he had the voice to back him out. The Messenger, it's push and pull funk. I think it's got enough variety in this album. It should have done a lot better. But as I said, In Excess were kind of yesterday's news. And yeah, there were a lot of things that were happening to Michael in the band, and, In Excess were on the wane commercially, but it should have done a lot better. Look on YouTube. Each of these songs has a video clip attached to it, and they're like little movies. So no expense was spared on this particular album. So Full Moon, Dirty Heart.
Yeah.
Bicycle Legs, do you have this album?
Yeah. I've got all, I was about to say I've got all the In Excess albums, but there's one in particular that I don't and won't ever own, and that's the last one. But yeah, no, it's a really good album. I think, this was what, 1993?
1993, yeah.
Yeah, so it probably suffered because of, grunge and Britpop and that sort of thing. I think In Excess were sort of yesterday's news because of that. So, that's probably a lot to do with it. And just as a little thing, when we get around to our honorable mentions, there might be a little bit more In Excess talked about. So,
No.
Okay. Well, let's do some honorable mentions. Liam, what have you got for us?
I got one that actually talked about with Colin Hay this year. Two Hearts from Men at Work, the final release. So he said to me the band was pretty much on death row at this time. I still think there's some really cool songs on here. So I see Man with Two Hearts, a great way to open the album. Given Up, Everything I Need, was a single choice that Colin Hay actually didn't like putting out. He said it was an alright song. Sail to You, absolutely love that song with a funky bass line. Children on Parade, great way to close out side one. Side two, Maria, Stay at Home, Hard Luck Story, my personal favorite from this album, Snakes and Ladders, and ending, which I think Colin Hay said this was his favorite from his album, or one of his favorites, Still Life, which is a great Greg Ham-led song. And the last one, contributed by Greg Ham, closing out a pretty underrated album, one that should not be forgotten about, Two Hearts from 1985, Men at Work.
Great pick. Mr. Bicycle Legs has always recommended that album, and I've never heard it, and I just recently bought it, and I must admit, it's arguably, it might be their best. I really, really like it. I think the songwriting is very strong, and it's a real head scratch that in such a short space of time, it's almost like a Vine story. They went from top of the world playing stadiums in America, #1 album in the US, and that album went into the cardboard cutout bins.
Yeah.
So, Liam or Bicycle Legs, any sort of
Well,
you got any theory as to why in such a short period of time?
I think the band was in the process of falling apart during that
Yeah.
album. Two of the members had left before the album was made, and a third one would leave in the middle of it. So it ended up just being Colin Ham and Greg Hay at the Colin Hay and Greg Ham at the end, and I think that had a lot to do with it. I think the record company didn't want to push it because they felt like the band were, you know, falling apart at the seams and that sort of thing. It did still go gold in the US, but that was probably on shipments rather than sales. As you say, a lot of them probably ended up in cutout bins and that sort of thing. But just before we go, I do have to do a shameless plug that Liam and I have actually done an In Defense Of show on Two Hearts over on my channel, Bicycle Legs. So do check that out if you get an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, and I think even in Australia, this album barely troubled the charts.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't do it well at all. But no, I feel better that I bought it. It's really good.
Another thing to mention too, there's a great documentary on Colin Hay on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth checking out.
Yeah, and I think he's touring Australia. And Men at Work are going to be on a package tour in America supporting Toto and Christopher Cross.
Yes.
That's pretty yachty.
Oh yeah.
All right, Bicycle Legs, what's your honourable mentions?
Okay, I've got a couple. Pretty big Australian bands that I'm going to talk about here, both starting with an I. And the first one is Icehouse. And the album I've picked as my dark horse for Icehouse is this one, Code Blue from 1990. This is an album, you know, when this first came out, I probably didn't care for it all that much. I thought it was probably a big step down from Man of Colours. But as the years have gone on, I've actually learned to appreciate this album more. It's one that's grown on me over the years. I always loved the first single, Big Fun. I think that's a great song. Miss Divine was the other single that did reasonably well. But you've also got songs like Knock 'Em Down and Great Divide, Mercy on the Boy, Charlie's Skies, Where the River Meets the Sea. It's definitely, you know, it's a little bit of a harder edge sound than Man of Colours was. They're trying to get a little more rock, I think, with this one. It didn't do as well. Like the singles were played on the radio and on the TV, like the clips. And I think Miss Divine troubled the charts, but the album itself didn't do very well. In it, Icehouse would end up only doing one more studio album after this, and then like they still tour to this day, but they haven't done a studio album since the early 90s. So that's one of my dark horses. The other one I did say I was going to mention In Excess again. I'm a sucker for really early In Excess, and I feel like it doesn't get as much love as it should, especially overseas. The first two or three In Excess albums really aren't very well known. I love Underneath the Colours. It's produced by Richard Clapton, who's another Australian music legend. You know, this has got the wonderful single Stay Young on it. This is very much In Excess in their new wave phase. And, you know, that's kind of my favorite In Excess. You know, it's also got Horizons. The title track Underneath the Colours is so good. Fair Weather Ahead, Follow, Barbarian, What Would You Do? Yeah, it's a terrific album. It's the last album that they would do on like a little label here in Australia called Deluxe before they would move over to, well, WEA Records in Australia, and I think they were Atlantic over in the US. So, yeah, that's my other honorable mention is In Excess, Underneath the Colours from, I think it's 1981.
I'll even go one further. There's a compilation album. I don't know if you probably could only get it at record fairs called In Excess Ive. And it's a collection of all those deluxe singles. And it had their first single, Simple Simon, We Are the Vegetable. Yes, they did do a song like that. And it's really punky and new wave and spiky, very, very infectious. So
You
I
know,
like it.
I first got exposed to In Excess by hearing their song Simple Simon on Simon Townsend's Wonderworld.
Yes, I saw that too.
Yeah, so I think you and I, Peter, can say we quite honestly with In Excess have been there from the very beginning. So
Yes, and that's for viewers internationally. That's a kids show. Look it up on YouTube. It was must-see TV, wasn't it, Peter Wicks?
It certainly
Yeah.
was. I didn't forget Woodrow.
yeah,
Getting right up in the camera. Yeah.
Drooling all over the desk. This big bloodhound with
Yeah.
the presenter.
Yeah. Jonathan Coleman got his start there.
yes, he did.
Yes, there were quite a few. Well done. All right, Harrison, what's your honourable mentions?
All right, got a couple. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this band or their lead singer, but Noiseworks' Love versus Money, which was the last album that they did before John Stevens went solo, while it wasn't the best-selling or the best-received album, it did have a few songs that have remained a core in the set list and since then. But the one that I want to talk about more is Jimmy Barnes' Two Fires from 1990. Now, as the follow-up to the indomitable Freight Train Hard, it was a disappointment, but it still had some really good songs on there, even if it did have a few low points on it. Between Two Fires, Hardline, the main single, Lay Down Your Guns, and a couple others that slip my mind at the moment.
And Peter Wicks.
I got a couple to mention. One is a I think they're from Brisbane. A young band there around now called Something Explosion. They haven't got an album out. They've got 2 EPs out. Propaganda Machine and I Hope You're Happy, which is the current one. If you can look them up on Triple J Unearthed. They're on Triple J Unearthed at the moment. But yeah, fantastic 3-piece. The singer, Grace Drummond, phenomenal voice. I first saw them when they were supporting Everclear, and they just sounded absolutely spot on. Like you rarely get a support band that says, geez, we had great sound. They normally sound like crap. So support bands, they have the worst mix going and sound all muffled. But these guys just sounded bang on. But fantastic songwriting, excellent vocals, and yeah, you should check them out if you see them touring. Other ones are The Clouds, Octopus from back in 1992. If you're like the Breeders, if you're into bands along those sort of lines, that's an excellent one to check out. And another young girl by the name of Tash Sultana, her debut album Flow State in 2018. Cracker album.
Great. I love The Clouds. I love Penny Century. That's probably their big seller on the most well known. And they've occasionally they do some reunion shows. I've got to catch up with them. They're still doing those shows. Honourable mentions for me, the Hoodoo Gurus, Purity of Essence. This is such an underrated album. I think there's 15 or 16 songs on it. It's just a masterclass of songwriting. Forget about the cover. The cover doesn't look very good. I'll put it on the screen. It covers soul, R&B, their garage pop, power pop. It's just all these different styles of music, and they just do it to a T. Like Dave Faulkner is Australia, he's the greatest songwriters. He's just fantastic. Speaking of great songwriters, Tim Rogers, You Am I, and Address Me Slowly. This has got the beautiful song Damage. So I'm just putting this album. A lot of the other songs off this album are very good. Get Up, Beautiful Girl, Gone, Gone, Gone. But Damage is just like a masterpiece. And yeah, it's probably an album that doesn't get a lot of, recognition. Divinals, Temperamental. I like this album a lot. It's got punksy, temperamental, Better Days. Even though it's probably not perfect, it's got a lot of killer singles, and it's still got that sort of the charismatic and stylish vocals of Chrissy Amphlett. Well, here we have it. We have done the Dark Horse albums. This is our recommendations. Liam Hare, thank you for joining the show. Bicycle Legs, Harrison, great to have you on, and Peter Wicks. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Tell us what your Dark Horse albums are in respect of Australian artists. But one thing's for sure, the Aussie Wrecking Crew will be back for another installment next month, doing one topic on rock and roll. I'll see you later, and cheers. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.